Hello, and welcome to another episode of This Week in Hearing. I'm Brian Taylor, and this week we're going to be discussing a handy new book, Teleaudiology Today, Remote Assessment and Management of Hearing Loss. And here with me to discuss some of the important content of the book are two of its authors, Vinaya Manchaiah and Wet Swanepoel. So, Wet and Vinaya, I want to welcome you to This Week in Hearing. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be with you.
Yeah. Well, before we talk about the new book, I'm guessing that most of our viewers have seen your names because you're two of the most prolific researchers that I know. But I thought it would be helpful if you could kind of introduce yourself, tell us about some of your work and your current affiliations. So, Vinay, we'll start with you.
Hello, everybody. I currently serve as the professor in the Department of Otolaryngology at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. I also have a clinical and leadership position as the Director of Audiology at the University of Colorado Hospital. My research has several different themes, but I think in the last 8 to 10 years, I've tried to focus on applications of digital health and technology, using this to kind of look at how to improve accessibility and affordability in ear and hearing care. Several years ago, Devet and I merged our forces in our labs to create something called as a virtual hearing lab. The idea with this is to perform studies across the globe, particularly in the US and in South Africa, in the full spectrum of digital health, anything from screening to intervention. I think in the last 2 years, we have definitely have more and more emphasis on over-the-counter hearing aids, both on the device, but more on the service delivery model. Trying to understand what kind of patient population is more suitable, or have better outcomes with over-the-counter hearing aids and things like that.
Great. And Duet?
Great, Brian. Yes, so I am an adjunct professor at the same institution as Vinay, so University of Colorado. So let me kind of jump in with that. And then I'm a professor of audiology at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, where I also head up the research for our WHO Collaborating Center for the Prevention of Deafness and Hearing Loss. It's the only center on the African continent. So a lot of the kind of teleaudiology linkage is also through the work we do with the WHO, really trying to make hearing healthcare more accessible and affordable. And we rely a lot on digital technologies, but also the service delivery models that they enable, where we can have decentralized service delivery models. Minimally trained persons can facilitate a lot of the initial services, and then remote support, teleaudiology services to really make sure that we provide the necessary care to people in a grassroots kind of level. So a lot of work happening in South Africa, but also across Africa. But then, as Vinay mentioned, also have close links to work in the US and with the over-the-counter hearing aid movement.
Well, I want to thank both of you for being here. And I want to mention to our listeners or our viewers that if they enter either of your name into a PubMed search, they will find dozens of articles, outstanding, timely work. So thanks for all the great work that you do. And thanks for being with us. And let's just move right into the talk about your new book. And I have a copy of it right here for those of you that want to know what the cover looks like. My first question, and Vinay, I'll ask this to you, I guess. What motivated you to write the book?
A few different things. The first, as we all know, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the physical distancing was, put on place. And as a result, we have to start looking at other ways of providing care to our patients. So, as we all know, the concepts of teleaudiology are not well covered in audiology educational programs. So a lot of the clinicians were left, trying to find information and hands-on training on teleaudiology. And I think all of us had quite a lot of requests to present webinars, do hands-on training and things like that. I think that was a kind of huge motivation. And then I also need to give credit to our colleague Dr. Bopana Balachanda, who kind of really put together a team. He basically was the one who persuaded me and Jay to jump on this project. Initially, we were highly excited and kind of started working on it, and then other things took priority, and then we kind of put the book on hold. And for several reasons, Dr. Balachandra could not continue on this project. And after a gap, a little bit of a gap, Devitt and Eldray joined the team, and we also had a few, external colleagues, Samantha, Laura, and Sophie Bryce contributed some excellent chapters. So with these things, we managed to get the book out in the last few weeks. Maybe one thing to add was also, before we start working on the project, we kind of looked at what is out in the market. So there is a textbook on teleaudiology with good information, but a little bit dated, but also it did not have the practical information on it. It was more theoretical, covering the concepts of teleaudiology. So we wanted to provide more hands-on, consulting style information in this text.
That's good to know. And I'd be remiss not to mention you have two co-authors that couldn't join us today, Eldra Bukes and Jay Hall. And I just want to acknowledge that they were. So we have four co-authors of the book. We're glad that two of you could be with us. So Vinay, tell us a little bit more about how the book is structured or organized, chapter by chapter.
Yeah, so we have kept the book fairly short, so that it is not a heavy read, and the book is targeted at practicing clinicians and also students who doesn't have any background or information in teleaudiology. So we assume no previous knowledge or background. And the book has 8 chapters. We start with an opening chapter on covering general concepts, definitions, and models, things like that. And following that, we kind of jump right into setting up the clinic. What kind of equipment you need, how to set up your clinic for different types of teleaudiology practices. Following that, in the 3rd chapter, we have a little bit of information on ethical, legal, and professional issues that clinicians need to be aware, with the teleaudiology practice in mind. And following that, we have 4 chapters covering screening and diagnostics, information counseling and shared decision making, fitting hearing aids and fine tuning them, and then finally tele-rehabilitation, providing rehabilitative services through teleaudiology practices. And finally, we also have a brief chapter covering challenges and opportunities, more futuristic ideas and things like that. So, yeah, fairly short text, but keeping the practical content in most of the chapters. Also want to mention that all of the authors in these books are clinician scientists. They are well-known researchers in the field, but also clinicians who have had excellent experience with patients.
Right, that helps. Exactly. And you mentioned the book is practical. So maybe you give us some examples. We can start maybe with one of the earlier chapters around screening and diagnostics, and provide us some examples of how teleaudiology might be used in that area of care.
Brian, yes, happy to kind of share some ideas there. Maybe just to reiterate 1 or 2 things that Vinay also mentioned. This field is such a rapidly evolving and changing field. I think back 13 years ago, we did a systematic review with Jay Hall, who's one of the co-authors on the book as well, on teleaudiology, and all the publications that were available at that stage. And it was just 27 publications, so early days. And if you look at the number of papers out now, it's exponential growth that we've seen into a variety of different fields. It's not just telehealth, it's also mHealth, there's eHealth, and there's digital health. And, the models even 5-6 years ago were very simple to explain. We had synchronous and asynchronous models, but now it's a little bit more diffuse and difficult to always kind of structure into clean little boxes, because we have things like, online services, and we have ChatGPT. All these things are kind of weighing into the way in which we deliver care. But in terms of maybe some practical examples, as you mentioned, the chapter 4 really covers the screening and the diagnostic components in teleaudiology. And as Vinay mentioned, we've tried to take a really practical approach so that clinicians can really, work through the content and also implement these solutions. So in this chapter, we give a couple of examples. I mean, maybe one of the traditional examples is something like electrophysiological assessment of newborns who failed their hearing screening in remote locations of Canada, Alaska, for example. If a child fails, there's no one there to do the ABR or the auditory steady state response. So telehealth is perfectly positioned for a remote assessment where a child can be hooked up by a technician to the electrodes and the equipment, and we can take remote control of the equipment, a specialist audiologist, and they can run through that electrophysiological assessment to determine if the child has a hearing loss, and if they do, what the degree and configuration of that loss is. So that's a typical kind of synchronous telehealth example. We've also, given some examples of some of the newer technologies, for example, online hearing assessments or screenings that can be conducted that clinicians can include in their, websites, where a test can be conducted and they can then remotely it's asynchronous, so it can run 24/7, so they can actually serve patients while they're in bed, but the next day they can look at the list of patients that have been referred and then contact them. So that's just a simple example of an asynchronous way in which a telehealth mode can support practices and audiological care.
Very nice. Could you tell us some examples in other chapters around fitting hearing aids, auditory training, or rehabilitation? And you have a follow-up, maybe provide some examples of how teleaudiology is being used in those areas?
Yeah, so we have an excellent chapter from Sophie Price, who's been doing teleaudiology for quite some time. I think at least over a decade. She has an outstanding chapter, particularly on hearing aids. How to fit hearing aids, as well as how to fine tune them, and what kind of things that are possible, through that model. And as we know that, soon after the pandemic, most of the manufacturers kind of quickly made that feature available for most of the hearing aids, and provided training on how to fit and fine tune hearing aids through teleaudiology models. And in addition, I think the other thing that is happening in that space, particularly with CI, is using smartphone applications for close monitoring of patients. Now at least one manufacturer has this app already, and then others are coming onto the board very quickly, where you can perform some testing, for example, digits in eyes testing, and try and understand what is the status of the patient, and also get some of the questionnaires and things like that completed, so that you have a much closer monitoring of patients. Traditionally you would have them visit every few months, and when they're stable, maybe every year or so. Whereas with this technology, you could actually monitor them very closely, and potentially reduce the need for some appointments, or create a need when or bring them in when there is a need that shows up in in this close monitoring. In terms of rehab, that's a whole another thing that we have not really done very much. So I think whenever we think about teleaudiology, we often think about screening and diagnosis, and maybe a little bit about fitting hearing aids and things like that. So what we see when we often talk to patients is, especially those who are far away, is they actually don't mind coming to that initial appointment to come get the screening done and diagnosis completed, and maybe even have the hearing aids fitted. But it's actually the rehab side that may benefit hugely from teleaudiology models. One, because it may require several repeated appointments. And the second, we are also not able to charge. A lot of the insurance does not cover for rehab services. So there are, I think, some very useful and interesting things that can be provided, both as a replacement care for rehab as well as supplementary care. You could have a couple of in-person appointments, and then time in between can be well used, providing self-led educational services through web-based, but now more as an app-based applications for all kinds of populations.
Oh, that makes sense. And that kind of leads my next question is, how do you see teleaudiology working with in-person care? I think some people refer to that as blended or hybrid care. Can you give us some examples maybe of how teleaudiology would work in tandem with in-person visits?
Yes, Brian, I mean, I think that's the most typical way, that telehealth models are rolled out in clinics, is where it kind of supplements in-person services in a way where some components are offered as a remote option. And so it's usually a hybrid. There's very few models that are fully telehealth, from start to finish. So I think many of the examples we mentioned, for example, support for hearing aid fitting or fine tuning, having the option to connect with an audiologist and have them make remote adjustments and changes and fine tune a hearing aid remotely. But they've come in initially as an in-person, appointment initially to connect with the audiologist and to do the initial fit. That's quite typical. I also think, there's hybrid models now that also kind of blend in with the screening component. I mentioned the initial kind of online use of a screening component where they connect to a practice without actually connecting with an audiologist, but they're doing a screening test or they're leaving a questionnaire that's completed. All of those are elements of a hybrid model if they then move into a face-to-face appointment thereafter. I think patients are increasingly having these as potential options, that they can pursue. And we have definitely seen a shift with COVID. Before COVID, telehealth was really very much a kind of ad hoc, small little service for some patients who felt that this was a convenience for them. But for audiologists, it was typically an inconvenience. And COVID certainly has changed the landscape tremendously. Suddenly everyone is used to having a remote meeting like we're having today. So it's not something that's strange anymore. There was initially a lot of concern and pushback in telehealth and in teleaudiology as well around is the engagement that you have through these means going to be equivalent to the engagement you're going to have in person? I think COVID has kind of sorted out a lot of the concerns around that, where you can still build good rapport. You can actually have a really quality interaction and conversation, very much like we're also enjoying now. And it has opened up people's, they're just more open to try it. There's been a couple of surveys out in the UK and the US as well, where health engagements through remote means has become the preference for many groups of patients. It's just convenient, and it offers them a way to connect with the health providers without having to travel and take out the time of their schedule. So I think there's been a lot of changes that have really enabled telehealth over the last 3 years.
That's all good to know. And I guess my next question is, and maybe it's not in the book, but I'm sure that you might have some thoughts on this. And it's, what type of patient, be it age, be it type of problem that brings them into the clinic, what are some insights that you might be able to share with our audience around who might prefer teleaudiology at least as part of their care?
Maybe I can share one or two thoughts and then see if Vinaya wants to kind of fill in, Brian. I think the one thing we have seen is that patients who like to self-manage their health, to be in control of their health, typically tend to like the idea of telehealth because it gives them the convenience, but also a little bit of the control in how they engage with healthcare providers. In that respect, it also kind of links with people who typically are a little bit more tech savvy, who are comfortable with technologies, who typically just are more open to try a telehealth model. And then that links a little bit to age, of course, so if the tech savvy component comes in, it's usually also individuals who are younger. But again, these are just generalized, observations. I think there's been a little bit of work on this. We certainly need more research to kind of see which patient groups and maybe even kind of personality types fit a telehealth model, and just not telehealth in general, but what types of telehealth models and access points. So those are just some of the initial thoughts from my side.
Yeah, I have a few things to add as well, Brian. I think there's certainly a gap in this, in this area. I think we fully don't understand, who are a right candidate for teleaudiology. I fully agree that highly motivated a person with ability to self-manage would be a good candidate with some technological competency. Those are like two requirements. But I'll give you a couple of examples why I think we don't fully understand. For instance, now almost all the hearing aid manufacturers have a smartphone applications, and as audiologists kind of tend to decide who is the right candidate for using an app, and we either over or underestimate, who is the right candidate for using an app. So I don't think there is a good way for us to say who would actually be better served, onboarding this an app. And another example that I'll give you is from one of our studies. We have done a series of studies looking at the efficacy and effectiveness of internet-based CBT for tinnitus. In that, our assumption was that obviously middle or younger age population would be well suited to this because they use the internet quite a lot, and older age individuals may struggle. In addition to looking at the outcomes, we also did something called as a process evaluation, which is very popular in the business world. Looking at well, we got from A to B, we got the outcomes, but what are the drivers that facilitated through this process? As a result of that process evaluation, we kind of gathered quite a lot of data that we wouldn't gather in a traditional clinical trial. For instance, we kind of looked at how many people were logged, how many people actually came into this website, how many hits we got, and then how many of them actually did the screening, and how many signed up to the study, and how many of them actually ended up staying in the study and completing the study, right? We looked at their demographic, like including age. And to our surprise, we had a very heavy, younger and middle-aged population who would come into the website and sign up. But when we looked at, who actually, went on to complete the study, it was mainly older adults, with tinnitus. So, to our surprise, I think we could probably have to look at this, with an open mind, who may be eligible, are interested, and who do well with the teleaudiology models.
Yeah, that's really interesting because in my own experience, somebody that you think is not very tech savvy turns out to be incredibly tech savvy. So you don't always know based on their age.
Yeah,
that's good to know. Final question for Duet. I'll address this to you. Where can people find the book?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Brian. So the book is available on Amazon. So there's a print version, but there's also a Kindle version. And of course, that's available anywhere in the world. Maybe it's also just important to note that all the proceeds from this book is being donated for research into making ear and hearing healthcare more accessible in Southern Africa. So the idea here is that we wanted to make this available as a resource, but we also wanted to make sure that the proceeds from the book keeps kind of feeding accessibility in terms of hearing healthcare in underserved regions. So that's just an important note that we like to kind of bring under the attention of potential readers. That's
great. And any final, Vinay?
So I have one thing to add to that point. The reason we chose Amazon Direct Publishing is the ability to quickly, get the information. as we know, this is the field where things are evolving, very quickly. The information that we provide here may not be current or up to date in a year's time, or maybe even a few months' time. If you had gone with a traditional publisher, then there is a certain checks and balances that kind of delays the process of updating the book. It would take at least a 6 months or a year process. So the reason we went with Amazon Direct Publishing is that, if we do find any of these concepts are outdated, we can quickly update the book with this information in a matter of days or weeks. So we welcome any feedback the users may have, and suggestions for improvement, for the future versions, so that we can update and keep the information current.
Yeah, that's great. And we'll put a link on the bottom of the screen so people know where they can find the book online. So thank you for that. And thanks to both of you, Vinaya Manchaiah, Wet Swanepoel, two of the co-authors of Teleaudiology Today, Remote Assessment and Management of Hearing Loss. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today.